Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCast, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
This is from Cointelegraph from 3 days ago. I was pretty shocked to read this. Pretty stunning headline. ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, and blockchain firms agree on 40 billion with a B funding for climate projects. So it says the International Chamber of Commerce has partnered with a Singapore government-backed blockchain startup to reduce carbon emissions in commercial aviation. So it's not a super long article, but there are several links within the article to take you kind of deeper into what is going on. This deal is a sideline from the COP25 conference happening in Madrid right now. But basically, it looks like this project is happening to help basically fund a carbon credits solution. It says here with the Civil Aviation Authority. So a lot of people have their opinions on, carbon credits and whether or not that is the right way to go. And the article also talks about the benefits of this solution partnering with a blockchain. But I think this is a really interesting story about the International Chamber of Commerce deciding to, again, as we've been talking about week by week, partner a blockchain solution with a climate solution and just like fund it. This is an enormous amount of money, obviously. And I think, these projects, if they're going to be funded correctly, do need a lot of money. And I think every week, as I've said, I find more and more examples of these projects happening. So if anybody wants to check out this link, I think it's a really interesting story of what's going on right now. We'll see what happens. So it's very exciting. I don't know if anybody has any comments about this, but I just saw this story. I thought we should share it because it's a big investment that they're making. Maybe nobody has any comments. That's okay. But yeah, it's a lot of money. So clearly there is a value in using blockchain technology. They're seeing that there's a value in using that to not only monitor these emissions, but also to that is the way that they want to. Let's see what it says here in this article. As Cointelegraph reported, the ICC has delved into blockchain innovation before after formally pledging to promote the technology to its 45 million members. The ICC previously cooperated with Fallon on an e-registry system for ships this year. In October, the Singapore Shipping Association and the ICC began working on the international e-registry of ship system based on Fallon's wavelet. At the same time, blockchain technology is increasingly viewed with skepticism by major global bodies. Well, I don't know. Well, that could be true. It depends on how you look at it. But anyway, this week, the World Trade Organization published what is called a reality check for blockchain and international trade. I guess I should click on that link and read that too. It says here, the deputy director at the ICC's Finance for Development Hub described the report as an indispensable tool for the entire trade ecosystem, but foremost clearly shows that standardization is in trade and trade finance is a key challenge to ensure the numerous blockchain-based platforms are of use for businesses that trade. Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. So anyway, I just find it really inspiring that somebody is deciding to put so much money behind a project like this. And aviation is one of the main places where people are really passionate about trying to get the climate crisis under control in terms of emissions. So I think this is just a really inspiring story. So anyway, my next thing that I wanted to talk about today is the COP25 conference, which of course is still going on. I'm going to put this link in the chat. If you guys aren't aware, there's a huge climate conference happening in Madrid right now, the annual conference. It's annual, right? Yes, I believe it's annual. Last year it happened in Chile. I believe it was Chile. If anybody wants to check that. I believe that's correct. But anyway, so I just put this link there. This is the headline. UN climate talks failing to address urgency of crisis, says top scientist. COP25 in Madrid is criticized for focusing on details instead of agreeing to deep cuts to emissions. So I just watched a speech by Greta Thunberg, and I watched some other of like the keynote speeches and the panelists, and there was also some protests at the conference from, you know, some sit-ins and some things like that. And it just looks like, you know, it's a really big shame because this conference, which is bringing together all these like incredible young activists and world leaders and people in the private sector, CEOs, all these amazing people. It just seems like what's happened is what has happened in the past is people are not willing to make the deep cuts needed. They're really getting bogged down by these like small, minuscule details. So this article, I can read you a little bit of it. What I take away from this is that there's real like bold leadership needed in the world on the climate crisis. There's a real poverty of ambition out there about what we need to do. And what I really appreciate about Greta's speech, which I can also link in the chat, I could just find a copy of it. She talked about the carbon budget. Basically, if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is basically the threshold to like a lot of really serious tipping points. I need to look up exactly what they are, but if we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, basically like it's possible we could lose all the coral reefs and like have no ice in the Arctic, and just like a lot of, that might be 2 degrees, but I need to look up exactly what it is. But anyway, above 1.5 degrees is basically like the threshold of like catastrophe. And there are some scientists that say like we're like totally on the path of like 2 or 3 or even more degrees right now. So like we need to make like obviously some like really dramatic cuts. And there's an amazing author called David Wallace Wells who I follow on Twitter and is really impactful and brilliant. And he wrote a book that has an enormous amount of scientific footnotes, and it's like not his opinion, like he cited a lot of different papers. It is called The Uninhabitable Earth, and basically it takes you through all these different scenarios if we don't meet these criteria, and if we have 3 degrees of warming, 4 degrees of warming and more, and shows just like what happens if we don't have arable land anymore, and what happens if you know, we have things called heat death, which is where, you know, millions of people will die from heat death, and just, you know, all these different things. Hopefully none of these things happen. But anyway, Greta in her speech yesterday, she talks about we have a carbon budget, which basically is like how much carbon we can burn over the next few years. I think it's like about 8 years left to burn 300 and something gigatons. I believe it's 300 something gigatons. I need to check this. And if somebody wants to check this right now while I'm saying this, that would be great. Anyway, we have like basically a carbon budget. And if we like burn more than that, or spend, however you want to look at it, more than that much carbon in the next few years, 8 or so years, we're going to go over the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we do that, then it's going to be really, really difficult to like survive on planet Earth, basically, because just a lot of things are going to go wrong. So anyway, this COP25, which was supposed to be kind of a turning point because of just the like momentum of the last year of climate protests with millions, like tens of millions of people taking to the streets and all this stuff. I don't know if you guys have seen the link that I put in the chat. A lot of this stuff was really supposed to like come at a higher level, and anyway, it's just really frustrating. I'll read you one paragraph in here. It says the stately pace of negotiations was in stark contrast with the scenes outside the conference in Madrid, where on Friday evening more than 500,000 people marched through the Spanish capital, led by the Swedish school striker Greta Thunberg. Of course, some of these kids were also speaking inside the conference, but that's neither here nor there. Protests continued through the weekend with Extinction Rebellion and groups from around the world. On Monday, Thunberg and other youth activists will hold meetings with officials inside the conference. Right, I just said that. Okay. We must bend the curve next year, says the UN conference. Oh, sorry, there was a paragraph here that I skipped. But anyway, next year is the year of truth, the year when we must move decisively to an economy that really starts to reduce investments in fossil fuels. Yeah, I mean, all this stuff is like this whole piece that I put in the chat is really important. So I don't know if any of you have any comments about this, but it's just really frustrating because, you know, we don't have much time left and the carbon budget is shrinking rapidly. So, you know, can't focus on the details. Got to focus on the deep cuts.
So the thing that strikes me is how truth is losing the battle. And I don't know what it's going to take. You know, we not only see it in climate change, you know, we see it in U.S. politics.
That's right.
So I don't know what it's going to take. Obviously, 500,000 people marching through the streets of Madrid isn't enough. So I don't know what the answer is, but yeah, so we have to face this on a lot of different levels. So I think somehow it's reaching out to people heart to heart. I don't know what else is going to move people. You know, I would have thought by now, you know, every single newspaper basically in this country has come out against Donald Trump, but still those few senators refuse to budge their opinion.
Right.
So what does it take? Obviously, the tools we thought, you know, tweeting, you know, none of these things work. You know, it's been proven over the course of the last 2-3 years that these are not, you know, they may make somebody feel good temporarily, but they are not the strategies to affect change.
I've seen some analogies to epidemiological science where they feel the solution to this might be inoculation. So get enough people educated in critical thinking so that we become more resilient to this kind of you know, conspiracy theory,
right?
science,
but look,
that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. But Benjamin Franklin said democracy works when you have free public education, when you have an educated populace. But now we have Betsy DeVos running our educational system. We have Trump convicted of defrauding Trump University people. We have the dumbing down of education throughout America. You know, some big percentage of schools no longer even teach Shakespeare. We have students having a hissy fit if something of an untoward nature is discussed in class, where teachers now have to warn students prior to talking about a subject that might be controversial. So we have, and you know, to me, this is the right-wing plot. They know that their biggest threat to domination is education. Even the Republicans said during the last election, we like, uneducated people voting for us.
At the risk of sounding political, I'm not going to say who it was, which president said this, but there was one president. If you want, I will tell you who said this. But one of the presidents said, if you think education is expensive, guess how much it costs to not educate our kids.
Yeah, who said that?
Barack Obama.
Oh, yeah, you can say that. I mean, see, this is my point.
Yeah. No, you're so right. You're so
We don't.
right. And it's,
We're so.
it is a real emergency. And
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, no, we're so worried about people not being able to handle it. I mean, we coddle our kids, even the kids in affluent areas with good education, and they're just friggin' coddled. I can imagine, if they happen to be reading Macbeth before, the bloody knife scene, the teacher's got to make an announcement, because they don't want any students to be upset. It's really interesting. If we actually had a war, like a physical war, which for us may not be our reality anymore, I look at these kids, how many of them would survive boot camp? I mean, we have weakened ourselves physically and I think emotionally.
Well, I mean,
and I have to think that's part of the reason why we make no traction on climate change.
I mean, I think a lot of kids these days, we're kind of getting off the subject of climate, but then again, it kind of comes back to it too. A lot of kids, I think, are a lot tougher than we think they are because we're actually a lot more traumatized than people think. Like a lot of people think that kids these days are so soft because, we need safe spaces and the trigger warning and the snowflakes and the whole thing. But a lot of that stuff comes from like fear of getting shot in school and like bullying that makes you want to kill yourself and debt that is like crushing you and no access to healthcare and
Absolutely.
you know what I mean, and like
Fair
our
enough.
generation like put up all the people to go to the Iraq war, and if you know some people that died, and like all this stuff is like really serious stuff.
Okay,
so, like,
but it's like, yeah, fair enough. Great arguments. I mean, great points.
Just saying.
But at the same time, to move it forward, this is going to be transformed by the youth with their energy.
Well, right.
I hate to go back to like the old days, but during the Vietnam War, there was a protest in Washington that I guess Nixon had all the protesters rounded up and put them in the old baseball stadium. So like 100,000 people protesting angrily. That's what we need. We need outrage. We need youth storming the offices of Exxon and Shell and forcing the issue. We need the youth telling their parents they don't want their blood money.
I mean,
all these things fall in it as long as people know they can invest in these oil companies and make a profit from their passive investment. It's not going to change.
Well, here's the thing. I totally agree with you on everything that you've said. And I've done protests personally outside of fossil fuel companies. In California, at the climate march, which was a couple of years ago, and there's been, and I've done like many of the Friday marches, but I can tell you, and I'm sure like people who might listen to this will, some will think that's effective and some, may not. But I will tell you though that I think like the youth have been like storming governments. The youth have been arrested. The youth have been like, if your question is like, okay, is it a question of, is the truth winning or losing? Like what you said before, the first thing that you said, 500,000 people protesting in Madrid, and yet still there's not action. Personally, I take a different view on that. I think the truth is overwhelmingly out there. Like, I think everybody at this COP25 conference knows the truth about what's going on. I think there's just like a lack of political will, and I think people have just given up because the problem is so big.
So yeah, no, good points. So Mike, right. So to me, like the protests are one prong of the approach, but where are the youth forcing the media companies? like every time I watch CNN and they pretend they're being balanced, but they're really just promoting the right-wing talking points. And every time they have a guest on who promotes the fact that climate change is a hoax, because they do it because under a fair and balanced reporting, but they're really just giving a platform to crazies. So where are these youth forcing their rich parents not to watch CNN, not to invest in CNN, not to invest in these companies? Where are the youth forcing these issues? Because that's how it's going to change. You know, I think right now the message is one thing. You know, where, you know, we have Facebook and Zuckerberg, you know, throwing elections, you know, because of profit. But meanwhile, everybody I know still uses Facebook, except for me. If we really, and I don't know how many in the climate change movement use Facebook, but Facebook has been co-opted by the right-wing advertisers. And everybody knows it, even the Democratic Party knows it, and that's why the Democrats don't do any counter-advertising on Facebook.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
meanwhile, how many kids are using Facebook? So if you really cared about climate change, if you cared about democracy, stop friggin' using Facebook.
Yeah, most of the climate movement is on Twitter now, but and I don't use Facebook anymore, but I agree with you and all that. And it's so cool that the CEO of Twitter has just come out saying he's not going to accept any political advertising on Twitter. And I think that's one of the big reasons why people like Twitter a little more.
But they still haven't cut off Donald Trump's account, even though he violates every rule of good language that Twitter has and anti-bullying, and Trump violates every single rule, but yet they refuse to cut off his account.
Unfortunately, he brings them, you know, enormous amounts of revenue, and so they have a bit of a double standard on that one. But
exactly. But we need to recognize that.
I mean, you and I recognize that, but
anyway,
you know, I don't know if I believe they should shut off his account, but
why not?
Well,
no, I know there's free speech, I get it, but Twitter is not a public platform. I mean, it's not a publicly government-run platform. It's a private company with guidelines, and they do cut off people. They cut off, you know, some, you know, bad actors, but they also cut off a lot of good actors, you know, voicing their opinion because they break their rules. But the president breaks their rules and they do nothing.
What I want is for the Senate to consider very seriously what is happening with the impeachment and to do what they think is right. That's all.
They're not going to.
I know.
I mean, this would be a circus. I mean, here we have this impeachment trial, and this is the last thing I'll say for this, is that, you know, Mitch McConnell is actually meeting directly with the White House and taking his marching orders from the White House. Now, this is a trial. I know it's not a criminal trial, but, you know, it's the same thing he did with the confirmation of Merrick Garland. And, you know, his approval rating in Kentucky is like 16%. They hate him in Kentucky. But he has this power, and until somebody else in the Republican, I don't know what I really don't know what it's going to take, but I find it very upsetting, obviously.
That's okay. So let's get back to this thing on climate, because I do think it's really interesting that, like, I think the truth is so widespread about what's happening to our planet. And obviously, to get back to the thesis of our call, which is climate and coordination, it's so obvious that the planet needs to coordinate. And I think it's so strange that, you know, you get all these incredible leaders together. There's so much available money there. You know, trillions and trillions of dollars. Oh, Greg has joined. Hi, Greg. There's so much available money there, trillions of dollars, you know, just 40 billion alone through the ICC, which we saw in the article that I shared from Cointelegraph, from that one deal. You know, so there's an enormous amount of companies and governments and nonprofits. There's just so much power there. You know, every country is represented, and, you know, just the power of the youth activists there. I mean, it's just such a zenith, if you will, or whatever we want to say, epicenter of change making. And then there's somehow still such a poverty of ambition, and it just really upsets me that the whole thing, and this is not just one report. I've been following it really closely on Twitter, which is, kind of where I follow the climate movement on a daily basis, and, tweet a lot of stuff about the climate movement as well. And it seems like a lot of different activists and a lot of different news outlets are talking about how this conference is really kind of failing to address the main issues, and how a lot of the leaders, especially the government leaders and the corporate leaders, which is kind of the main people who have the power here, because the corporations are the main emitters and the governments are the main legislators. They're really the ones that have the power to change, right? Of course, the public can put pressure on them, and the media can really get the message out, but it's really the governments and the corporations that really can really affect what's going to happen. They really are doing things like double counting emissions, getting bogged down with details and all of this, but everybody there knows the truth. There's really they're not really debating the facts there much. There's not really much climate denial going on there from what I'm seeing from the reports. I mean, obviously, why would you go to why would you go to COP25 to deny anything? It's like the world's best scientists all there gathered. It's just really upsetting to me that this is happening, because there's so much opportunity for change to take place, and yet there's just such a massive stagnation. And I always read this adage about how everyone wants change, but nobody wants to change. And the carbon budget is, again, as I said before, is rapidly dwindling. We have such a small amount of carbon left to burn if we want to stay beneath 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the coordination needed is so is rapidly approaching. And I just to hear that the talks are stagnating is really frustrating to me. So obviously the conference is going to go on, and hopefully they can find a way, but they're even arresting, well, I don't know if they're arresting, but they are, I need to look up what's happening here, but they are kicking out and disbarring some of the Indigenous youth from the talks for staging protests. Like, these kids are doing some peaceful protests to draw attention to the fact that these talks need to be more aggressive. They've done some really harmful stuff. They're like taking the badges away from these kids, and I don't know, it's just really bothering me. So I'm hoping that we can come to a more clear consensus on what needs to happen, because it's not easy speaking of coordination, it's not easy to coordinate thousands of people into one place to even get them into a room together, to get these talks to happen. So, and we see what happens when we get these people together, like this deal that I spoke of, the International Chamber of Commerce deal, the $40 billion that they gave to that Singapore blockchain fund for the aviation emissions reduction. That's an amazing deal. That's an amazing project, and it's so much money, and I just can't, I'm so looking forward to what they're going to do with that. And it would, just think about if our chain was at a conference like that, and it'd be incredible, like the kinds of relationships we could build with people like that. But
we have to build the tools, right? If we're climate change and coordination, then we have to build the coordinating tools on our platform.
Yeah, but just the fact that
to facilitate.
Yeah, but I mean, we're a blockchain. It says it in our intro video on the front page of our website. We are a blockchain that cares deeply about coordinating, the most serious, coordinating and solving the most serious problems that humanity is facing. And right now that's the climate crisis. And so there are not other blockchains that have those aims, and they're not prepared to do that, at least not mathematically, which is where
that's my point. So how do we create coordinating software do that, because that's what we do, right? You know, we're a technology software company.
Yeah, I mean,
Actually, I might step in here.
great.
I don't know if anyone's had a chance to look at the most recent RCast, but one of the ways that I've been approaching the coordination layer or the coordination in general is to think of it in several different layers. So there's a telecommunications infrastructure that our chain provides at the most basic level, like that blockchain, our blockchain provides a telecommunications mechanism. But then there's a next level up from that. You can have the best technology in the world, but if it's used for nefarious purposes or in willfully ignorant ways, then it's not going to help. But there's such a thing as what I call social technology, and this is not the same as social media, but is more rules that we follow in order to conduct social processes. A really good example is Robert's Rules of Order, which is used to conduct meetings, such as the ones that they hold in the House chambers. The thought is to find principles that would allow for the creation of social technology at internet scale. Like it's hard to imagine doing an internet scale process using Robert's Rules of Order. But you can imagine other kinds of technologies that work at that scale. And these are better than voting. Right? Voting, one of the ways I describe it, but voting is like binary, right? It's yes or no. And we're trying to use a binary language to communicate between the collective and the individual. And that's just too low bandwidth a language to have a sort of, a highly nuanced conversation, which is what we need to have now. And we need to have them very frequently. And so, I've proposed several principles and given very specific examples for how we might begin to explore coordination. And I think one of the most interesting is that we work better when we de-risk things, at least psychologically. So when we play, we're more likely to come to good results. So this is why I focus on games as a means as a framework in which to begin to explore this higher bandwidth coordination. But whether or not you believe that hypothesis, and I strongly, I encourage anyone who finds this interesting to go look at the most recent RCast, because I talk about 4 distinct games that events different aspects of the principles that I'm proposing. But the truth of the matter is, the people really do have the power. It's not particularly hard to organize a tax strike, right? I mean, if we wanted Congress to change, if 250 million or 300 million people said happy to pay our taxes when you're happy to address climate change. Climate change would be the #1 issue in Congress immediately, right? Just on January 15th, no one sends in their tax returns. Instead, they communicate, to their congressperson, I'm not sending in my tax return until the climate change is the #1 thing that Congress is handling, right? That would be immediate change. If you want to look at other ways of coordinating, there again, nonviolent protests.
That's a great idea.
But I mean, these ideas are all around us, right? I mean, they're very, very simple, right? If you want to address one of Bernie's biggest issues, which is the wealth distribution. Look, all of the people who have most of the wealth can fit in the contact list of a modern cell phone. They have names and they have addresses. You simply make a no-fly list, right? And you pass it around. And whenever any one of these people comes into a shop or a hospital or an airport, you just look and you say, oh, you're on the no-fly list. I'm sorry, we're out of business today. Can't help you. And 1 week of that, they would get the message, right? And then there would be bargaining at the table.
Yes, the Lysistrata strategy.
That's exactly right, right? But it can be done. Any of these kinds of protests, they're peaceful, they're simple, they're straightforward. And as long as you have clear demands, like if it's, you can't hold people hostage. You have to say, this is the aim we want to achieve with this action. Then it can be done, right? So the people have all the power here, right? The way you have to think about it is, there's a playground. There's 100 kids. 2 kids have all the candy, and they got it by nefarious means. What's going to happen? It's kind of that simple, right? And if we can keep it in these sort of stark, practical, simple terms, we can change things. I'm interested in a movement towards more subtle, richer, and more satisfying forms of coordination that I think will have lasting effect in terms of how we treat planet Earth. And that's why I lay out the principles in the games that I laid out. But I think all of these things, you know, we can get this done. We just have to do it.
Yes, I agree that we can get it done. And also, if we don't, let's not say what's going to happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to be quite realistic. It is much too late to avoid the consequences. There will be consequences, and they will be really onerous and burdensome, and mostly to the people who, you know, are in poverty. That is just, it's a fact, right? The aquifer under India is down to a quarter of what it was. And with
Lake Chad is like gone, basically.
And with the glacial melt, that aquifer is not likely to be refreshed. So we have to think about what's going to happen when India runs out of water, when a population the size of India runs out of water.
Yep. Yeah.
So we have to be prepared for those consequences and help people out as much as possible, because they're unavoidable at this point. We've dilly-dallied too long to avoid very serious consequences. So if you need fire in your belly to think about, you know, how to go about organizing a tax strike, those images are very useful images to get some fire in the belly.
Is it actually in the Constitution that it's no taxation without representation? Or is that the Declaration of Independence?
Neither. That was a rallying cry to as a part of the.
Oh, it's actually not written anywhere.
No, it was a slogan that
it's the equivalent of a meme.
Yes, it was a colonist meme in response to the British Empire.
I understand. Well, there you go. See, that's something that I should know. But people learn things on these calls.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
so I mean, we could put some effort behind, you know, a tax strike. That would be quite interesting.
I think that would be very interesting. I think it would spread around the internet extremely quickly.
Well-
Somebody would wind up on Jimmy Fallon giving an interview in like 3 weeks. I just think that.
Well, be sure to bring your violin, Nora.
Oh God. Yeah. No, I just think like that would be very popular. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it would cut across party lines.
Because who doesn't, or who does want to pay taxes right now? And also like the climate thing is so uniting. You know, not to get political right now, but I since we've kind of wrapped on the most important things right now, and Derek, I'm going to leave it up to you whether you want to include this or not. I was listening to CNN or something, and Ned, I know you're going to roll your eyes right now, but anyway, I was just watching the news, and they had a guest on who was like actually saying something really interesting. Can't remember who it was, but anyway, they were saying how, you know, half of the, it's not, well, of course it's not half the country, because half the country doesn't vote. So it's like, you know, maybe a third of the country is like really wants impeachment. Third of the country, like, you know, obviously thinks the whole thing is sham or whatever they say. But then like, there's like this 70% of the country for the past month or longer really thinks, regardless of if they want him impeached or not, really thinks that our president definitely did something morally wrong. And this guest on CNN was like, how can we unite this 70%? Like, what would be the action that Congress could take that would unite the 70% of the country? You know?
Yeah, I don't think it's really, I think Congress is reactive. I mean, right now it seems like they're proactive, but
Well, yeah, and maybe that could be. I'm not really saying like that's
what
what
we
we
need
should
to
do.
do is we need to move the sentiment of the people. And then once the politicians, and listen, you're not going to get everybody, but once you
No, I know.
get, you know, the 5-10% who are themselves fighting for re-election, like Susan
Totally.
Collins, those are the populations that you have to change their sentiment so that they put the pressure on their politicians.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I thought, yeah.
So we need to lead the politicians and not have the politicians lead us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's about 25 other things he should be impeached for. Anyway, my point is
Yeah,
that
me too.
to use this as an example, just as a total example, I'm saying I think there's so much common ground on the climate. Like some people like have very strange views about the climate, but they all understand that there's pollution. They all want their children to be healthy. They all understand public health. They all understand poverty. Everybody has something when it comes to the climate that they can grab onto. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Even if not everybody is in agreement about the scale of the crisis or how serious it's going to be, or that it's 100% caused by humankind, or even if people have bullshit about the last warming period, or like just they bring up these really terrible, bizarre points that have nothing to do with what's actually happening. Like, you can grab onto some kernel of sanity within them and just say, okay, well, do you want your grandchildren to have clean water? Of course I do. Okay, well, let's grab onto that then, and stop with the medieval warming period shit, and let's grab onto that. You know what I mean? And like, you just grab onto some piece of sanity within them. You know what I mean? And like, or like, you know, you talk to like a farmer in Iowa and they're like, well, I don't know about this climate thing. And you're like, okay, well, do you want to be able to farm? And they're like, yes, I want to be able to farm. And you're like, okay, well, here we go. Like, you do the Obama thing and you like build you like get the Venn diagram out and figure out where you're in the middle with somebody. Do you know what I mean? Because on this climate stuff, there's got to be more than 70% of people that agree on basically all of it. And I think like the catastrophizing, well, I mean, we do need to catastrophize because the carbon budget, I don't know if you saw, Greg, I was talking about this for a long time before you joined, but you can listen to it later if you want. Probably don't have time. But the carbon budget, Greta's speech at the COP25 yesterday was so good. She talked about the carbon budget. I don't know if you know, we have 8 years left to emit about 300 gigatons of carbon.
Yeah, yeah, but that's like an extremely conservative measure. When you start looking at how rapidly
Well, right,
things are
and she talked about that.
destabilizing,
Right, she talked about that.
yeah,
Fiber also agrees. So
fiber agrees.
Fiber agrees. Everybody agrees. And so, yeah. And so the carbon budget and so all that stuff. But if you talk to like, some people about the carbon budget and all this stuff, they're not going to come with you. But if you talk to them about like basic stuff, like, do you like oranges? Do you want to ever have an orange again?
Well, I think it's also, I think we have to somehow gamify it and get people's greed. Because, I think we were talking yesterday about, the economic potential of actually having a green economy. And I think that's kind of also a way to do it. Just, people can become rich, by following better practices, and there's a whole industry, and we can actually get really good paying jobs for those people who may not think they have good paying jobs now. So we could, so that's another way, just through economic incentives.
Totally. I mean, there's a school of thought out there that I don't know if this is what it is called. I call it lead with greed. And basically what I call it like that because it's like, the whole idea is basically you get people to be greedy, but it's greedy for a good reason.
I love that. You need to make up t-shirts. We need to do memes. Lead with greed.
But
greed,
like, yeah.
Yeah.
But so basically like you just get like Chase Bank to like build every solar panel possible and they get rich off of it. We're okay. But there's a downside to it though.
Yeah,
and
but the downside can't be worse than it is now.
Well, maybe though, because there's a lot of different people who study these kinds of movements and study economies and civilizations and stuff. And basically they think there's a lot of really great talks about this and books about it and stuff. There's a lot of people that think the same thinking that got us into this mess, into where we are now, economically, socially, environmentally, into this rampant capitalism, this system where people are dying and these long hours and just being abused by this psychotic system and so much poverty in the world, so much inequality, killing so much in the planet, like half of the forests in the world are now gone in like such a short amount of time, all this shit. The same thinking that got us into that probably cannot get us out. And that's the idea with that. And so while I would like to think that it would be awesome if we just incentivize all these capitalistic characters, the banks, the capitalist leaning governments, the democracies, all these people into thinking like, hey, just buy your way out of it. Just build a bunch of shit. Just become greedy about the climate crisis. And then, we'll be fine. There are a lot of people that think, no, we have to think completely differently and we have to have a total shift we have to cooperate. We need to value human life. We need to value, like, if we're greedy about this, it's just going to be inequality.
It could be, but you have to start somewhere and the clock is ticking. So
that's true.
I was hoping to circle back on something you brought up, Nora. You had a news item about $40 billion with a B in funding for climate projects coming out of the UN's International Chamber of Commerce.
That was just one project, yeah.
Right, but already the article said that you have a fledgling blockchain and one exchange, a carbon credit exchange for airlines, which is already looks like it's being funded. And I've been digging into that to see, okay, what blockchain is getting that funding? Who's plugged into that? And it's one called Perlin, Perlin. I wasn't familiar with. And I'm just wondering how RChain might be able to get involved in building that solution.
Okay, let's email them today. Who wants to email them? I can do it.
I'm trying to navigate that. But
I
it
don't know
looks
if
like,
I'd be the best person to reach out. Somebody else might have a better like technical explanation of like who we are, but like who wants to send an email? I mean, what the hell? You know?
so it looks like there's a partnership right now between the ICC, which has that $40 billion in funding, Perlin, which is a blockchain which is being created, and Air Carbon, which is the exchange application, which doesn't, I don't think it's a blockchain itself. I think it's just a DApp that they're looking to build.
Yeah, I mean, all those three entities should know who we are, you know? I mean, because like probably the ICC is going to fund more projects. Perlin might need our help if they fail or like need better blockchain tools. And Air Carbon is probably going to do more stuff.
Yeah, Perlin, they say they're building something called Wavelet, which is a DAG-based protocol that uses WASM.
Yeah, they're promoting 31,000 transactions per second.
Yeah, so like, I mean, all those three, I mean, I did write down the contact information for ICC on my spreadsheet of funds, even though technically they're not a fund, but like they do fund projects. But like we should write to all those three because obviously like this is not going to be the only climate based blockchain project in the world that's going to require a blockchain, you know? So
yeah, Wavelet combines WASM smart contracts with a high-speed ledger.
Mm. Yeah.
Greg is sipping his tea this morning.